My name is Samuel Ross Lee. I have attended Howard University for a couple of years. I attended and graduated from Morehouse College. I attended and graduated from Harvard Divinity School, and I am presently attending Yale Divinity School. Morehouse and Howard are predominantly Black institutions, so I saw almost all of my professors. Interestingly enough, at Morehouse, I was a philosophy major, and my primary professor was Hispanic, but mainly, most of all my other professors were African American. I attended two high schools because my parents moved when I was in the 10th grade, and I remember one teacher who was the math teacher in 10th grade. I don't remember anymore. Well, because it was normal, I think I didn't really think much about it, quite frankly. Interestingly enough, my first 3 years of school, of course not high school, my first 3 years of school, I went to segregated schools, and all of my teachers were Black. I was young, obviously, first, second, third grade, but I didn't really think much about it after that, quite frankly. The Black male educators at Morehouse, particularly, were mentors. They were, it was a comforting environment, quite frankly. Morehouse is a teaching institution, as opposed to a research institution. So there was a lot of opportunity to have advisors and mentors who were Black males in that environment. It was not represented in high school. And like I said, I didn't really think much about it at that point until afterwards, after I got out of high school and into college, and maybe even beyond that, I realized that it would have been a better situation, perhaps, if I'd had that kind of representation in high school. I think we have to determine what we're calling a problem and why we're calling it a problem before we can define it as a problem. Are there a lack of Black male educators in schools? Yes, but why are we calling that a problem? What is the problem that they're not there? I think those are the questions that need to be asked and answered before we can define it as, quote unquote, a problem. I'm not quite sure why it decreased, but I mean, 2% is certainly not a high percentage in the first place. And I think that a lot of Black students coming out of college, male and female, a lot of us are first generation college students, as I was, and first generation college graduates. And many people are looking for jobs that pay higher, and that will support a comfortable middle class and perhaps even upper middle class life. And since those possibilities are available, they're not going to the teaching profession because it doesn't pay. Well, we need to think about education very differently in this country. The fact of the matter is that public education was primarily peopled in terms of teachers by white females, and it was a middle-class job for Black women. Many of the Black schools, for example, that were built were created primarily to train preachers and teachers, and that was a very explicit thing that they, focused on, and it was a middle class, type of employment for that during that time. But in the white schools, it was mainly white women who served in those positions or worked in those positions with lower pay, oftentimes because they were women, but also they were supplementing to some degree an income of their husbands had, corporate jobs and this kind of thing, and they were not the primary breadwinners. So the low pay was not an issue then. It has become obviously an issue now. We need to think differently about education and how we pay for it in this country. We need to pay higher salaries to these positions so that there are a lot of people, I think, I've heard of, who want to go into teaching, but they don't pay enough. So they go to law school, or they go to med school, or they go to business school, and those sort of things, so that they can get higher pay. But they would love to teach, but they don't feel that the engagement they have to put into school and graduate school or whatever is they're compensated for that what teachers are paid, and then the fact that teachers have to come out of their own pockets to pay for material within the school, which is, in my estimation, criminal. I mean, the school system should be paying for the materials that the students need. Teachers shouldn't have to come out of their pockets, and particularly when you're paying them so little, to pay for material that students need in school. It just makes no sense. Like I said, I don't think a lot of black males come out of college are looking to teaching in the profession, and many of the so-called deans of disciplines that I've noticed from this school are people who are retired, and they're doing this as, you know, something extra or extra income to supplement their retirement income or whatever, or they're transitional. They're not permanent. They're not intending to stay in these positions and that sort of thing. I think the effect that it has on students, I think, is what you're trying to get at here, and in that regard, I think it has a negative effect because the students, black nor white, see these persons, black male people, as professionals, as intelligent, as able to educate, but they see them as persons who are placed in positions to be disciplinarians, which, you know, goes with that sort of aggressiveness and that sort of thing. These sort of stereotypical characteristics that are placed on black men in the first place. And so I think there's a subtle and underlying problem with that, subtle but significant. Brown versus Board of Education was the attempt to integrate the schools under the notion, which I don't quite frankly agree with, that Thurgood Marshall argued that separate is inherently unequal. That was his argument. A better argument, I think, would have been that because the schools are separate, the money, the resources are unequal. And because we are not willing to make those things equal, then we must integrate the schools. But quite frankly, we could have given the same resources to African American schools and to white schools, and they would not have been inherently unequal. To say separate is inherently unequal is to say that Morehouse is inherently unequal to some predominantly white school. Spelman is inherently unequal to Agnes Scott because one is predominantly African American, other is predominantly white. So I think it was a very bad argument, quite frankly, but it was the one that won the day. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if anybody benefited from it, quite frankly, as was expected. Because what we have done, of course, is that you look at the statistics. We have resegregated in a very subtle way. The suburban schools have more money. They get a similar and same amount of money from the government, but then they're basing money on tax, dollars or housing, property, and that kind of stuff. And so they end up with more money. The so-called charter public schools, which we know are not public schools because they don't have public input, are totally segregated. I mean, like 98% of those schools are African American students, and most of their staff is 98% of their staff is white. I'm not sure who has benefited more from that, but I do know that African American students have not benefited from it as they were supposed to benefit, because they have been placed in environments where people don't understand them, understand culture, understand history, understand ways in which to engage students because they're not connected to those students. When I did go to segregated schools, my teachers were people who lived in my community. They were people who went to church with my parents. They were people who met my parents in the supermarket. I remember distinctly one time I got in trouble in school, and my teacher did not send a note home, and she did not call my house. She came to the house. That's what segregated schools were. That relationship between teacher and parent, I think, has been significantly a chasm has developed, and it's growing significantly larger as the time goes by. Well, I think integration in general has affected the Black community more so than the school as a singular institution. I'm not quite sure that we can analyze the effect of integration by merely looking at the integration of school. Segregation was supposed to be about allowing people to use resources that their tax dollars paid for. But it did not necessarily mean that within the Black community, institutions that were run by Black people, owned by Black people, needed to close down and shut down because the possibility to engage in white institutions now existed. But that happened a great deal. I'm not sure that we can put that on the school integration, but it certainly happened based on integration in the wider sense. The question was around, the recruitment of more African-American males to the teaching profession. And my response to that was, why aren't we trying to recruit more African-American males to corporate America, to institutions and jobs that pay much more than teaching? We're not actively trying to recruit a bunch of white men out of corporate America into the teaching profession, where they're making a lot of money, have a lot of influence, have a lot of economic stability as a result of those jobs. But we're trying to recruit Black men into jobs where the money is not being paid as, in an equitable way to those jobs. And so that becomes a question, an issue for me, that we're trying to recruit Black men into low-paying jobs, despite the social, what we're calling the social ramifications of that. I think there's a significant problem with asking them to take on that particular responsibility. Yes, it's what I said earlier. We need to raise the salaries. We raise the salaries to respectable levels. We would attract more people in general. And among that, more people will be more African-American men. Taking on a job that gives them the ability to raise their economic status to a level that's respectable as it relates to their classmates who are coming out of college and going into finance on Wall Street, and going into medicine, or going into law school and law firms and that sort of thing. The job needs to be considered more respectable. And quite frankly, the way we respect things in America is by giving money to it. And what we're saying by giving teachers low salaries is that we don't really respect the institution. We don't really respect the profession of teaching, particularly in public schools. The pay system of our school, of the school system, or how we pay teachers, does not attract necessarily the best teachers, and does not give our students the best education. And it is seemingly set up to maintain an inequality in our nation that is perpetuated because people who have more money and more access can always go to private schools, which are particularly set up to get them into colleges and gear them towards certain schools and that sort of thing. And we have to, let people in public schools sort of fight for quality education, which maintains a system of inequality, maintains a system where a great deal of students do not get the education that qualifies them to be at the best schools and to have the best chances in life.